Welcome back. In the previous video, we already discussed this. We said that when the domestic economy opens its door and trade with the rest of the world, we're gonna say that the domestic relative price of cloth would increase to the global level here. Okay. Now, because the relative price of cloth gets higher, so for consumers, they find that cloth becomes more expensive relative to food, so they're gonna buy less cloth and more food. Okay, and of course, more food comes partially from their imports from the rest of the world. Okay, so here QC becomes smaller and QF gets larger, so that's why when we move from 1 to 0.2, then on the horizontal axis we're moving towards the left, okay, with a smaller ratio here, or relative quantity of cloth. Okay, now remember we said that you can also try put the RS world down here below the domestic RS. Okay, and I would strongly recommend you to try this on your own, okay, and say if RS world stays below the RS domestic, then what's going to happen when the domestic economy trades with the rest of the world. Okay, so how producers and consumers would respond to the change in relative price, and how the relative price would change. Okay, another thing I would like to challenge you guys is in our discussion here we said that this after trade, the domestic relative supply curve tend to go that way, right? And so the relative price of cloth would increase all the way from here 0.1 level to the 0.2 level. Okay, but have you ever thought about this RS word might be shifted after trade, like what I put here, the green one. Okay, or you may think RS word would never change, it would just stay there no matter what. Okay, so here again the question is, under what circumstance would RS word shift? Or you could believe that it won't shift at all. Okay, so again, bring your thoughts to our class. We're going to discuss these. Okay, all right. Now based upon that DRS model, we can talk about the income distribution in gains from trade. Okay, finally we get here. So we're going to say international trade will benefit the factor that is specific to export sectors. As we said, because in this case it's going to be cloth, right? The unit price is going to be higher after trade. Okay, so the cloth manufacturers can actually make more money, so they tend to expand. Okay, and that's why we would say the benefit trade would benefit the factor that is specific to the export sector. Okay? However, this conclusion is actually built upon what we already derived. I think probably two videos before, when we discussed the specific factors model. We already said over there that if the relative price goes up, then the owner of the specific factors in that sector tends to be better off. Okay, if the relative price of the product tend to decreases, then the owner of the specific factor in that sector would be worse off. Okay, so that's the next one we're gonna discuss here. International trade will hurt the factor specific to the import competing sectors, which again is pretty straightforward. Okay, intuitively, because here, for example, the food sector faces more import competition, right? So they would definitely get hurt because of that, right? Finally, we're going to say, the international trade has ambiguous effect on the mobile factors. Okay, so in this case, it will be labor. Okay, now how so? Again, remember what we discussed before in the specific factors model. Okay, that's the conclusion we already derived over there. If you remember, we said that for labor, it's better off or worse off depends upon two things. Okay, I'm sorry, let me take that back. It depends upon one thing, which is a real wage, so W over P. But in this specific factors model, it depends upon two things because we have two prices, right? So it's W over PC, okay, and W over PF. In other words, real wage in terms of how many units of cloth you purchase or how many units of food you purchase, right? Or for most of us, in reality, it's probably going to be a combination of the two, right? So remember here we said the relative price of cloth increases because of the trade. So your real wage in terms of cloth is going to go down. In other words, W over PC is going to go down. Here, the nominal wage will go up, but not as much as PC. Once again, this is a conclusion we already drew in the previous discussion. Okay. However, the real wage in terms of food will actually go up. Okay, so these two are moving towards the opposite directions. That's why here we said, our conclusion is going to be ambiguous or unclear. Okay, if someone, would spend the majority of her wage on cloth, then she's probably going to be worse off, okay, because cloth is more expensive now. If someone spent the majority of her wage on food, then she's going to be better off, okay, because the purchasing power of her nominal wage in terms of food is stronger. Okay? Now, putting together, obviously here, trade creates winners and losers. Okay? So that's what we call the distributional effect of trade. Okay? Now, here, because it has a winners and losers, so we definitely want to know, does the gains from trade outweighs the losses? Okay? In other words, what losers lose and what winners win, who is greater? Okay? What's the net effect for our economy? Now here we got to recall, what we already learned from the Ricardo model, right? Back in chapter 3, Ricardo model says the entire economy should gain from trade, okay, regardless of the distributional effect. Okay, so overall, the country should be better off. Okay, but that doesn't mean everybody would be better off. Okay, now here we're gonna show the gains from trade with the indifference curves on the next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about that. In a minute or so. Now here, because trade creates winners and losers, so we could conclude that the gains from trade are not evenly distributed. Okay, not evenly distributed. Now, since because of this, then from the policy perspective, we would say benefit redistribution is needed but difficult. Okay. Now, why benefit redistribution is needed? As we said, we got winners and losers. because of trade, right? So as the public policy, we would expect, the government would take a portion of what winners win and give them to the losers, okay, as a compensation, right? But again, this is quite difficult. Okay, so later, I believe in chapter 9, we can talk about this, okay, why it's difficult. Okay? But intuitively, again, you could imagine it is not easy for government or anybody to figure out, how much exactly winners win. Okay, it's probably easier for us to figure out how much losers lose, right? For example, when you look at these workers, in Ohio producing tires, right, or other manufacturing products, if they lost their jobs, then we can easily figure out, what was their wage before and how long they have been unemployed or even drop out of the labor force, right? So what would be their economic loss? Okay, so that's relatively easier for us to figure out. But in terms of how much winners win, it may not be that easy. Okay. All right. So now let's come back and look at how we can use another way to show gains from trade. Okay, here with the indifference curves. Now this 4-quadrant graph we should be super familiar with at this point, right? We already discussed this before. Now, as we said, if suppose we know the indifference curves, okay, and these indifference curves would help us find the optimal combination between food and cloth the economy leads, okay, and then it can figure out how much labor should be employed in food sector versus the cloth sector, right? And we said previously that at the optimal production point on the PPF, we should find the indifference curve, which is just be tangent to the PPF. So in this case, I put 0.2 here as the optimal choice of production. Okay, in other words, the optimal allocation of labor here between the two sectors. Okay. Now suppose here, because of the trade, relative price change. Okay, so the optimal allocation of labor between the two sectors is no longer at 0.2. Instead, what we find is, this economy would like to produce more cloth and less food, right? So we're moving from 0.2 here to 0.3 down here along the PPF, okay? Now, because 0.3 now is the optimal combination, so when we go to the 3rd quadrant, we find that here it's going to be the optimal allocation of labor between the two sectors. Okay. Again, this tangent line just show us that that 0.3 gives us the optimal choice of production. Okay. But at the same time, if you want see this closer, you find that I intentionally put this tangent line the way it is, so that it's actually also tangent to the indifference curve U3. Okay, and this is actually the point where the economy can consume or maintain its consumption. Okay. Now remember, previously without trade, the economy produces at this point, and the indifference curve, which is tangent to that, would be U2. Now, with the trade, the economy can actually achieve U3. Okay, that's exactly the gains from trade.